know they come in vesicles. When I say that their release is quantal, what does that mean?
Discrete units.
Yeah, so there's always a fixed amount per packet that I let go. So how does that affect my signal, the magnitude of my signal? And so if I release like 6 quanta, I will have 6 times my end plate potential, is how they like to talk about it. So the magnitude of my signal will be that many times bigger. So what does that tie into? It ties into either my EPSCs or my IPSCs. And so who can tell me what those two things are and why they're here?
Excited for an inventory for small.
And so again, why do we care about this today?
Action potential.
They add somehow. So what are the 2 ways they can add?
Temporal.
And what are the differences?
Temporal is same place, different time.
Exactly. So this basically dictates who wins. It's whoever dumps out the most neurotransmitter. That's how they start. Clathrin, the big thing to remember is it is the protein on clathrin-coated hits during endocytosis. Neurons pulling things back in, which is big for neurotransmitter like reabsorption and things like that after the fact if they're not metabolized in the synapse. Synapsin is the molecule that we use inside the cell. It basically takes your vesicles, attaches it to the cytoskeleton, and kind of shunts it down towards the axon where it needs to go. Snare complex. She will for sure ask you about the snare complex. So, 3 things that make up the snare complex: synaptobretin, syntaxin, and SNAP25. Are they on the vesicle or are they on the nerve? Or on the membrane?
Full synaptic.
And then where is synaptotagmin?
On vesicle.
So synaptotagmin is basically what binds calcium and says, okay, we're ready to go. The other 3 are already sitting there waiting, and as soon as synaptotagmin binds calcium, everything links together, fuses, out goes neurotransmitter. I put up in that top corner just as kind of a reminder about the 2 things that will increase velocity of your signal. So diameter and degree of myelination. Any questions about that?
I'm sorry, you said the snare complex is on the vesicle or on the where is it?
Remember,
Membrane.
it should be on the cell membrane. It'll be actually on the cell. All 3 of the clues are yes. The other is on the vesicle. Okay. She loves people knowing the 5 things that make a neurotransmitter a neurotransmitter. What? Yes. Present in the next one. What else? Take yours out. Stopped. Specific receptors. My brain is today. 2 more. Exogenous application. And when do we release it? Released with electrical stimulation. Okay. She has that chart of what are big neurotransmitters, what are the small neurotransmitters. The big thing to know is what goes where. So the standard things you think of as neurotransmitters go in your clear core vessels or vesicles. So that's dopamine, serotonin, things like that. Then you have your large, dense core vessels. Those are the big molecules, the peptides, the hormones, things like that. So you gotta remember large, dense core, large molecules. Clear core, small, straightforward neurotransmitter molecules. Cell signaling. So, any other questions on the neurotransmitter lecture? Pretty sure. Cool. Yeah.
So, just to make sure, so is synaptobretin on the vesicle or is it on the membrane?
It is on the vesicle.
Okay, so they're just 2 on the. Just want to make sure
I don't think she'll be that picky, just know what forms the actual snare complex versus what is independent.
Okay.
And synaptotagmin is totally independent of the snare complex. Okay. Cell signaling. So we have about 6 different methods of cell signaling, and we can give you some examples of contact receptor.
Immune cells?
This is on your left arm. You do have to know connexons for a vaccine lecture. Just knowing that connexons are these 6 subunit cores that make up your gap junctions. What's the point of gap junctions? Cytoplasmic continuity, keep everything talking to each other. So if you guys already covered that, I would move on to, this is starting to go into Dr. Geyer's stuff about different receptor subtypes. So you have the ligand regulated receptors. So tyrosine kinase is good to know. What's the mechanism of tyrosine kinase? How does that work?
Dimerization, autophosphorylation by receptor binding to substrate.
So, right? So tyrosine kinase receptors are not going to function unless they dimerize, right? These 2 inactive halves, as soon as something binds to them, they will fuse and do signal transduction. Contrast that to guanylyl cyclase, for example.
National Cycle GMP.
Should I get messed or somebody mumble it? And same thing with serine kinase. So the net result is that all of these start with something binding to them on the cell surface, and they will transmit their signal into the cell. Tyler, do you remember if he wanted the specifics of what they'll do?
No, that's whenever they get tested on the AMS packet.
No, but I mean, PGF insulin and all that.
You can talk about that. No,
Yeah.
that'll
Yeah, I
be,
mean, be familiar with it, don't burn a ton of time on it.
yeah. It's more about how the receptors work,
Yeah, yeah.
which you already did in the tyrosine
The
kinase.
ligand gated. So the big thing here is that these 2 are not individual, like, they basically are channels that will lead to depolarization, but they don't necessarily have to do an intracellular cascade like the ligand regulated do. If you have acetylcholine that binds to a nicotinic receptor, that channel just opens and the cell depolarizes, and that's its job. Same thing with GABA. But it's not acetylcholine binds and then there's a big signal transduction that leads to an actual potential. No, it's just that pore opens and depolarizes. Intracellular are typically things that will directly deal with DNA itself, like nitric oxide, or nitric oxide has an intracellular receptor, steroid hormones. So those will come back again and again and again. Give me examples of some steroid hormones. Estrogen, testosterone, anything derived from cholesterol is much. And then lastly and basically anything intracellular is going to affect the actual like internal functioning of the cell. The big thing with steroid receptors is that they go straight to DNA and they affect the function of the cell on a transcriptional level. Nitric oxide kind of has some of its own intracellular receptors and it doesn't necessarily go on the DNA level. G-coupled protein receptors, these will be the bane of your existence because they will happen over and over and over and over again. So as you remember from Dr. Geyer's packet, there are a couple different pathways that it can take. Which are those pathways?
SGI.
The SI and Q are the receptor subtypes. What do they act on?
Alpha beta receptors.
There you go. So be aware of those. And again, remember when a G-coupled protein receptor is activated, it dissociates into what 2 subtypes? Or subunits, I should say.
Alpha and then beta gamma.
Alpha stays, beta gamma goes. So receptor regulation. So this is another big issue in terms of how people respond to drugs and why we care about all that. Desensitization. So this is basically taking your receptors and altering them in some way. Saying, maybe let's not have as high an affinity for this molecule. So if you accidentally run into each other, you're not going to react right away. So usually that's phosphorylation. If you go and phosphorylate all of your receptors, they're basically more sluggish in how they respond to a drug's presence. So you're not going to get such a potent response to it. Downregulation. Just don't have as many receptors. You don't get as potent a response. The size of a response response to a drug is wholeheartedly dependent on how many receptors react. That's going to decide how strongly that cell reacts. Heterologous desensitization is basically going into the cell somewhere and saying, okay, this usually makes a bunch of CA-AMP. I'm going to inhibit it down all cyclase. Then we can make a bunch of CA-AMP. So as much of that drug combined as it wants, but I'm not going to get that second messenger response. The net result is that the drug is no longer effective either entirely or at the potency that it originally was. That's why we care. The other issue is, especially with downregulation and things like that, is it can then lead to a huge rebound effect if people redose on those drugs. So think about with opiates, things like that, that's partly why their reaction is so bad after the fact. They've adapted, they've downregulated all their receptors and say, okay, we have a lot of opiates. If they were off opiates for a while and then get back on, now they only have 3 receptors. They're going to be maxed out as soon as you put that drug in that system. Okay, drugs. Yay. Okay, physical properties. What is the usual size range of drugs?
100 to 1,000.
Why?
You can get across membranes.
So what happens on the small end if you go any smaller than 100?
It's not specific.
Yeah, they just kind of diffuse everywhere. They'll probably get chewed up by enzymes. They're just not super effective. And if we get above 1,000, too big, can't get anywhere. Shape. Why does shape matter? Specificity and chirality. So most drugs on the market are what? Racemic mixtures of 2 enantiomers. There are drugs that are very profound examples of why chirality matters, such as thalidomide. There's one, carvedilol, and its enantiomer. They both have different effects, even though they're roughly the same structure. And again, when I say chirality, what am I talking about? Yeah, basically. So, going on to agonist, full versus partial. So when I say partial agonist, it does mean partial in the sense that you get kind of half the actual response. They'll also use the term mixed affinity agonist antagonist because it basically doesn't care if something is in the active structure or the inactive structure, it's just gonna kind of find it. So the net effect of administration of a partial agonist will actually decrease the efficacy of a full agonist. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah.
Can you override that one competitively by giving a bunch of full agonists or not? Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, you can. Clinically, you're never going to be in that environment because then at that point you're just like slugging somebody with drugs. But yeah, it's basically competitive antagonism at that point. Any other questions on the basics? Cool. Methods of administration. So I'm going to name one. You guys are going to tell me the pros and cons. Oral.
It's easy to do.
Easy, usually cheap.
Breakdown, big molecule.
High first pass.
Did it get back?
First pass is the big thing with the liver. And that usually means that's something we have to factor in when we're figuring out our loading dose and maintenance dose, because there is going to be that initial metabolism. And we have to think about which drugs are liver toxic, are they metabolized in the liver? We have to think about, does that drug have active metabolite? That's going to affect my dosing. Rectal administration, pros and cons. Unpleasant.
Can be given
Bypasses.
Bypasses the stomach and bypasses the first pass.
Only halfway, right?
Yeah.
Because it will still go into the bloodstream, which will still go to the liver. Yeah, this is typically for patients that are already unconscious. Sublingual.
Fast activity.
Why do we like sublingual?
Directly to the bloodstream.
Bypasses the first pass, and it comes on really fast. What is an example of a drug that we really commonly give sublingual? Nitro. Fast onset, low first pass. Parenteral.
No first pass.
very specific.
No first pass, 100% bioavailability. Why do we not like parenteral?
It's, you can't do it. You can't do it.
Well, I mean, you can do inhibitors and antagonists and things like that. We don't like parenteral. Hey, what happens anytime you break the skin? Risk of infection.
Oh, sepsis.
risk of infection. The other issues with parenteral, pricing. Parenteral drugs aren't cheap. Think about all the equipment that you have to go through to get someone a parenteral injection. Pulmonary.
What's going on?
It's kind of very.
Irregular dosing. Why do we like pulmonary?
Specific to that one.
Very specific to that area. The other big perk of pulmonary administration, there's a huge surface area. You're going to get pretty good diffusion that way. Topical.
Easy.
Inefficient. Yeah, it's,
Slower absorption.
Alright.
yeah, so if I wanted to alter topical absorption, what are things I could do? Larger surface area,
Thinner skin.
thinner skin,
Concentration.
yeah, increase the concentration, so that I almost guarantee will be a question, you'll love the topical question.
For that, why does heat matter?
Partly because you vasodilate,
Okay.
and the skin is more able to absorb.
So larger, thinner skin, heat, larger surface area, anything else?
Increase the concentration of the patch. Yeah. So for example, if you love talking about scopolamine, which is a motion sickness patch, and you typically put it behind your ear because the skin is significantly thinner there. Okay, all good on this stuff? Cool. One more round of breather, and then we're gonna get back on. Questions? Okay.